Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are immersing ourselves in the life and legacy of one of the 20th century's most influential and, well, complicated scientific figures, Edward Osborne Wilson.
That's putting it mildly.
We're talking about a biologist, a naturalist, an ecologist, a writer, and this is a story that stretches from, the deepest swamps of Alabama all the way to the hallowed halls of Harvard.
And it covers everything. I mean, from the microscopic architecture of an ant colony to a unifying philosophy for all human knowledge. This is a colossal figure in modern science.
Absolutely. People have called him everything, right?
Yeah.
Darwin's heir is one you hear a lot.
Darwin's heir, the father of biodiversity. Our sources show a man whose ambition was just relentless. He made these groundbreaking contributions in fields from entomology to conservation, and he won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for general nonfiction.
Which is incredible for a scientist.
It is. But at the same time, he found himself repeatedly at the very center of some of the fiercest academic and, frankly, political controversies of his time. The sheer breadth of his work and the scale of his vision for the planet, it's still astounding.
And our listener, the learner, is looking for that comprehensive shortcut, a genuine deep dive to understanding Wilson's immense impact. We need to trace his path from the tiny world of ants, which earned him the nickname Ant-Man.
A great nickname.
All the way to his grand theories on global conservation and the unity of knowledge. So we have to unpack not just his brilliant breakthroughs, but also the deep ethical and political questions that his ambition sparked. And these questions still reverberate really loudly today in the scientific community.
Okay, let's unpack this. To truly appreciate Wilson's impact, you need to understand the trajectory of his curiosity and, I think critically, his focus. We'll start with a surprising childhood accident that inadvertently defined his entire scientific path.
And from there,
we'll explore his major foundational ecological theories that really established his reputation, and then dive headfirst into the explosive sociobiology debate. I mean, that was the academic firestorm that nearly derailed his career.
Right. And we'll then track his later work, focusing on his monumental push for a global synthesis, this concept he called consilience, and of course his conservation legacy, including that incredibly ambitious Hafford proposal.
And finally, because a full picture is absolutely necessary, we have to address the difficult posthumous revelations, the things that came out about his private correspondence that complicate his celebrated life story.
And force us to look critically at the ethical standards of, great scientific figures. It's a dense journey, but I think it's filled with some real aha moments.
Okay, so here's where the narrative of Wilson's life takes this incredible, almost cinematic twist. His razor-sharp focus on the world of tiny insects. It wasn't a random choice. It was a physical necessity. It was a direct consequence of an injury he suffered as a child. Edward Osborne Wilson was born June 10, 1929, in Birmingham, Alabama, and he spent his formative years in constant motion.
Moving all across the southern U.S.
Exactly. Places like Mobile, Decatur, Pensacola, this constant movement and separation, his parents divorced when he was 7, it may have contributed to his deep reliance on the stability of the natural world.
But the truly defining moment, the one that changed everything, happened at age 7.
Right, during a fishing trip on the Gulf Coast. He recounts this mishap where he was pulling in a fish, a pinfish, and one of its dorsal fins flew up and stabbed him right in the eye.
And what's just remarkable is that the source material shows he never sought immediate medical treatment.
He was so determined to stay outdoors, to keep fishing, that he just ignored the injury. He kept going.
And ignoring it had these severe consequences. Several months later, his right pupil clouded over with a cataract,
which led to surgery that he described in his autobiography, Naturalist, as a terrifying 19th century ordeal. And the eventual result was the complete loss of sight in his right eye.
And this is the moment where, tragedy really does turn into scientific destiny.
It absolutely does. The loss of the right eye meant he lost stereoscopic depth perception. That crucial ability to judge distance that comes naturally with 2 eyes, so observing birds or mammals or anything large and distant became difficult, really frustrating for him.
But there was one piece of luck.
The one piece of luck was that he retained full sight in his left eye, and that sight was exceptional. 2010 vision.
Wait, so he lost the ability to judge distances, which is terrible for large field biology, but his 2010 acuity actually made him better at seeing things up close. That feels like an incredible scientific twist of fate.
It was a constraint that channeled genius. Wilson explained that he could still see the fine print. He could see the minute hairs on the bodies of small insects with perfect clarity.
So the world of big things was fuzzy and two-dimensional.
But the world of tiny things was crystal clear. This physical limitation became the foundational lens through which he viewed and ultimately explained all of nature. He was forced to focus on the little things, the six-legged world.
And this wasn't just a hobby for him. It was an intense, youthful passion.
Oh, completely. He was collecting insects constantly. He achieved the Eagle Scout Award and even served as the nature director at his Boy Scouts camp. He was entirely immersed.
The Ant-Man identity, that really solidified when he was just 9 years old.
Yes, he recalls an expedition in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., where he pulled back bark from a rotting sweet gum tree and discovered a colony of brilliant yellow citronella ants.
I remember this description.
He described them as short, fat, brilliant yellow, and emitted a strong lemony odor. And he noted that this encounter left a vivid and lasting impression, providing him with a species he could study in immense detail.
And his deep dive into mere ecology, that's the formal study of ants, it was accelerated by a totally unlikely historical factor.
World War II. It was the sheer practicality of wartime shortages. Because there was a scarcity of insect pins, the kind you need to preserve flies and beetles, he switched entirely to ants.
Because you can just put them in vials.
Exactly. They could be efficiently stored and preserved in vials of alcohol. And with encouragement from a myrmecologist at the National Museum of Natural History, he began this rigorous, comprehensive survey of all the ants in Alabama.
As a teenager, that's incredible tenacity.
It is. And that tenacity paid off immediately with a major, though pretty unwelcome, discovery.
The fire ant.
Absolutely. Through that comprehensive survey, he became the first person to report a colony of invasive fire ants in the U.S., finding them near the port of Mobile. This systematic, species-by-species work laid the foundation for his entire career. It showed he could master the taxonomy and microecology of an entire group of organisms in this incredibly rigorous way.
And before he moved on to Harvard, he earned his BS in 1949 and then his MS in biology in 1950 from the University of Alabama. What's really fascinating about his early life, and I think this is a great note for you, the learner, is a fact he shared in his book, Letters to a Young Scientist.
This is a great story.
Wilson revealed his IQ was measured as an underwhelming 123 by today's standards, and he intentionally used this fact to prove that perceived raw intellectual horsepower is secondary to sheer tenacity, focus, and the diligent application of knowledge.
It was a message of encouragement that hard work trumps innate genius, and that perspective really defines his career. That diligence led him to Harvard, where he earned his PhD in 1955.
And his thesis?
His thesis, a monographic revision of the ant genus Lasius, was a deeply technical, systematic work, and it set the foundation for his eventual 4 decades on the Harvard faculty. He started as an ant taxonomist, focused on microevolutionary processes.
Specifically, how new species emerge.
Right. How they emerge by dispersing into new, less competitive habitats. This led directly to his early theoretical work, developing what he called the taxon cycle, which is a framework for understanding species dispersal and evolution, particularly in island settings.
Okay, so having successfully channeled his unique focus and established this mastery of taxonomy, Wilson then turned his synthesizing gaze toward the broader principles of ecology.
Right. Before the big philosophical battles, he was a foundational scientist who wasn't just describing nature. He was formulating mathematical rules to explain the distribution of life on Earth.
What's continuously fascinating about Wilson is this ability he had to take mountains of complex real-world field data and just distill it into these elegant, universally testable theories.
That trait defined his entire career.
Yeah.
One of his early triumphs, which is often overshadowed by the later debates, was in animal communication. He collaborated with a mathematician, William H. Bossert, to create a classification system for pheromones.
Okay, this sounds very technical, but why was classifying chemical signals so important?
Well, before this, people knew insects communicated with scent, but Wilson and Bossert provided the formal framework for it. They categorized pheromones based on the speed of their diffusion and the duration of the message they conveyed.
So like an alarm signal versus a trail marker.
Exactly. Alarm signals diffuse and disappear quickly, while trail markings last for a long, long time. This framework gave entomologists and eventually chemical ecologists a common vocabulary for understanding chemical signals across all kinds of species. It was a classic Wilson move. Take a natural phenomenon and give it a testable mathematical structure.
And then there was that 1956 paper, co-authored with William L. Brown, Jr., that defined the theory of character displacement. This wasn't just some widely read paper. It became an ecological classic.
It was a massive conceptual leap. Character displacement describes an evolutionary outcome where two similar species who are facing high competition in areas where their ranges overlap evolve to become more different over time.
So like Darwin's finches.
It's the perfect example. Imagine two closely related species of finches, both eating seeds of a certain size. Where they live separately, they might have the same beak size, but where they overlap, the selection pressure is immense.
So they specialize.
Exactly. The finches with slightly smaller beaks start eating smaller seeds, and the finches with slightly larger beaks specialize in larger seeds. They're driven apart evolutionarily to reduce direct conflict.
So competition forces divergence.
Right. They diverge in traits related to resource use or mate recognition. It's a beautiful example of microevolutionary adaptation in action, and Wilson's paper helped codify the theoretical and observational framework you need to study it rigorously. That's why it was honored as a science citation classic.
But his most famous and enduring early ecological work, and perhaps his least controversial at the time, was the theory of island biogeography.
This is truly a cornerstone of modern ecology. Developed with Robert MacArthur, the 1967 book, The Theory of Island Biogeography, is still a standard text.
And the core problem they wanted to solve was pretty elegant.
Very elegant. Why does a given island, and that could be a landmass in the ocean or a small patch of forest surrounded by farmland, why does it have a predictable, relatively stable number of species?
That seems like an impossibly complex question to model. What was their solution?
They modeled it mathematically. They argued that the number of species on an island, the equilibrium number, is determined by the dynamic balance between two opposing rates.
Which are?
First, the rate of immigration. So new species arriving on the island from the mainland or some source pool. And second, the rate of extinction, the existing species dying out on that island.
So an island that's close to the mainland will have a higher immigration rate, and a large island will have a lower extinction rate because it can support larger populations. Is that the essence of the model?
That is precisely the essence of it. They plotted the expected rates on a graph. Extinction increases as the number of species goes up because there's more competition. Immigration decreases as the number of species goes up because there are fewer new species left to arrive.
And where the two curves intersect, that's your equilibrium.
That is the species equilibrium number. The model predicted that large islands close to the mainland would have the highest biodiversity and small, remote islands would have the lowest.
And the beauty of this theory wasn't just the math, but the fact that Wilson was willing to test it in the most dramatic way possible.
That's the genius moment of the empirical ecologist. In the 1970s, Wilson and his doctoral student, Daniel S. Simberloff, they executed what is perhaps the most famous experiment in all of field ecology.
They chose those tiny, remote mangrove islets in the Florida Keys.
Right. These islets were home to a distinct, easily identifiable population of arthropods, mostly insects and spiders.
And what did they do to them?
They literally defaunated the islands. They erected these huge tents over the islets and fumigated them, systematically eradicating all insect species.
They hit the ecological reset button.
A total reset. It sounds ruthless, and you noted that, but it was scientifically brilliant because it created a true zero-species starting point.
And what did the observation confirm?
Over the next few years, they meticulously tracked the colonization. The results were stunningly consistent with the theory. They watched the subsequent repopulation by new species, tracking the immigration rate from the mainland and the eventual extinction rate of the colonized species.
And the numbers matched the model.
The species richness eventually returned to the exact predicted equilibrium level. It demonstrated that the mathematical model accurately explained global species distribution patterns, not just as a theory, but as a reality. This cemented Wilson's reputation as a world-class scientist who could synthesize taxonomy, mathematics, and ruthless field experimentation.
So, having conquered the world of ecology with elegant mathematics and hard data, Wilson then turns his synthesizing gaze toward the messiest, most complex subject of all.
Human nature.
Right. And this shift, which he formalized in 1975, is where everything changed. He published Sociobiology, the new synthesis.
This book was a massive intellectual leap. It was ambitious and dangerous in equal measure. Wilson began the book focused logically on ants and other social insects, the superorganisms he knew best.
But the controversy was all about that final chapter.
Entirely. It was the final chapter where he applied those same evolutionary and biological principles to explain human behavior and social organization. It wasn't just a ripple, it set the entire academic world on fire. It led to a decade-long intellectual cage match.
So this raises the important question. Why such an explosive reaction?
Because Wilson established sociobiology as a unified field by explicitly linking the social behavior of non-human animals, from eusocial insects to vertebrates to human social structures. He was arguing for a biological and inherited component to human behavior.
He was arguing for biological determinism, wasn't he? That we aren't blank slates.
Exactly. He asserted that all animal behavior, including human social structures like cooperation, hierarchy, and division of labor, is the product of heredity interacting with the environment. And the core challenge was his famous metaphor, the genetic leash.
The genetic leash.
He argued that our evolutionary past imposed inherent biological limits on how much human culture and behavior could be molded.
That idea, the genetic leash, it flew directly in the face of what was considered progressive and intellectually sound in the humanities and social sciences at the time.
It was a direct assault on the prevailing academic doctrine of the mid-20th century, which was often rooted in the concept of tabula rasa.
The blank slate.
Right. The idea that humans are born as blank slates, and that all behavior, social structure, intelligence, even gender roles, are purely the result of culture, learning, and environmental conditioning. That perspective was dominant, particularly among scholars who rightly feared that linking social traits to biology could be used to justify historical inequalities, racism, and misogyny.
So Wilson was arguing that evolved, inherited tendencies structure human social organization, predisposing us toward certain behaviors, while his opponents were arguing society was entirely constructed and malleable. The stakes couldn't have been higher.
And the criticism was immediate and intensely personal. The opposition coalesced into the Sociobiology Study Group, which was associated with the organization Science for the People, and it included two of his most prominent Harvard colleagues.
Geneticist Richard Lewontin and paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould.
The heavyweights. They didn't critique the ant chapters, they went straight for the human implications.
Right. Their focus was entirely on what they saw as the potential political misuse of the theory.
They accused Wilson of advocating racism, misogyny, and genetic determinism. They argued that he was attempting to justify existing social inequalities, everything from the gender pay gap to ethnic differences, as natural or biologically predetermined and therefore impossible to change through policy.
And the famous response was that open letter against sociobiology.
That letter was a pivotal moment. It explicitly criticized his deterministic view of human society and human action. Lewontin and Gould saw this as fundamentally dangerous science. They argued that historical precedents show that attempts to link human social structures to genetics had consistently led to horrific political outcomes, like eugenics.
They saw his work as providing the next generation of pseudoscientific ammunition for right-wing political agendas.
And Wilson saw this not as a scientific disagreement, but as a political campaign against free inquiry. He published his own rebuttal, Academic Vigilantism and the Political Significance of Sociobiology, where he challenged their motives. But the confrontation escalated far beyond just rhetoric.
It did. The academic battle turned physical in February 1978.
At the annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, while Wilson was speaking at a symposium on sociobiology, he was surrounded by members of the International Committee Against Racism.
This event is truly shocking to read about.
It's an indelible, unfortunate image in the history of academic disputes. The protesters chanted slogans, including the highly inflammatory phrase, "Racist Wilson, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide."
And then they doused him with water.
Yes, physically doused him with a pitcher of water, humiliating him publicly.
I think it's important to acknowledge that even his harshest critics, including Stephen Jay Gould, they condemned the physical attack itself. But the message had been delivered. Wilson's ideas were considered politically toxic and existentially threatening by a very vocal and organized segment of the academic community.
And that confrontation forced a major, painful reckoning within the scientific community. A battle over the very definition of humanity and the relative weight of genes versus culture. It fueled the rise of fields like evolutionary psychology and behavioral genetics, but it also forced all scientists to be far more rigorous and careful when discussing biological influences on human social behavior.
And Wilson's response wasn't to retreat. He doubled down.
He did. He immediately followed up the controversy with On Human Nature in 1978, focusing entirely on biology's role in human culture. And that book, which aimed to clarify his theories, earned him his first Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction in 1979.
And it included that wonderfully provocative line, "The evolutionary epic is probably the best myth we will ever have."
That statement encapsulates his scientific humanism. He wasn't dismissing the human need for myth or meaning. He was arguing that science, specifically evolution, provides the most profound, beautiful, and verifiable origin story available to humanity, one that deserves to replace older, conflicting religious narratives.
Wilson's drive toward these grand unifying projects never stopped, even when that ambition put him in conflict with his own intellectual allies. His later work, defined by the concept of consilience, shows his persistent, almost spiritual need to link the natural sciences with the humanities.
And that persistent drive was always anchored by his deep knowledge of the ant world. In 1990, he co-wrote The Ants with the zoologist Bert Holdobler.
A monster of a book.
Oh, a monumental encyclopedic work. It cataloged the life histories of thousands of species and became the definitive text. And it deservedly won his second Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction.
And it was in this context that he made that famous, extremely provocative remark about political philosophy and social structure.
Yes, he said, Karl Marx was right. Socialism works. It is just that he had the wrong species.
That analogy is brilliant in its succinctness.
It perfectly articulates the sociobiological difference between insect and human societies, specifically when it comes to cooperation and reproductive fitness. He explained that eusocial species ants, for instance, they lack reproductive independence. A single worker ant is sterile. She cannot reproduce without a queen.
So if they can't reproduce themselves, how do they pass on their genes?
Their only path to increasing their Darwinian fitness is by serving the colony, the superorganism. They maximize their shared genetic legacy, the genes they share with the queen and their sisters, by behaving altruistically. They prioritize the group above their individual self-interest. They are, you could say, evolutionarily hardwired for socialism.
But humans are fundamentally different because we have reproductive independence.
Exactly. An individual human maximizes their Darwinian fitness primarily by looking after their own survival, having and protecting their own offspring, and seeking individual resources. Wilson implied that while cooperative behaviors are part of our human genetic toolkit, our biology doesn't permit the complete selfless devotion and lack of individual reproductive imperative necessary for a true communist or socialist state on the ant model.
Our individual biological imperatives constantly undermine total group cohesion.
That's the idea. And this brings us to his most ambitious theoretical project, Consilience.
Published in 1998, Consilience, the Unity of Knowledge. This was his attempt to bridge what the philosopher C.P. Snow called the two cultures.
The gap between the natural sciences and the humanities. Wilson defined consilience as the synthesis of knowledge from different specialized fields. He wasn't just suggesting vague collaboration. He was arguing that all knowledge ultimately rests on physical, verifiable scientific principles.
So he wanted to apply science to art and religion. How did he propose doing that?
He argued that even complex human activities are constrained by our evolved biology. In this framework, Wilson defined human nature as a collection of what he called epigenetic rules.
Epigenetic rules.
Right. The genetically inherited patterns of mental development that guide human learning and behavior. You can think of these rules as the hardwired grammar of the mind, which then allows culture to be the language we speak.
Can you give me a concrete example of an epigenetic rule in action?
Sure. Take the innate fear of snakes, or the universal human appreciation for certain types of natural landscapes, like savannas with distant water. Wilson suggested these aren't learned behaviors, they are quick start rules, evolutionary shortcuts programmed into our minds because they promoted survival millions of years ago.
The incest taboo would be another one.
The incest taboo, what's called the Westermarck effect, is another, a predisposition to avoid mating with close associates you encountered during childhood. He argued that these patterns could and should be studied scientifically, which could lead to new understandings of architecture, music, and social rituals.
But this relentless drive for reevaluation and synthesis, it created a schism with one of his most prominent allies.
Richard Dawkins.
Right.
This was a major, highly publicized dispute within the field of evolutionary biology, and it centered on multi-level selection theory. For decades, the consensus view championed by Dawkins and based on the work of W.D. Hamilton was kin selection.
Which argues that altruistic behavior evolves because it favors close relatives who share many of the same genes.
Exactly. The classic line is, I would lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins because that preserves my shared genetic heritage.
And Wilson rejected this.
Yes. Based on new mathematical models he co-developed, Wilson argued that kin selection was not the primary driver of social evolution. Instead, he championed a revised form of group selection.
What's the difference?
The idea is that the unit of selection is the gene, but the immediate target of selection is the individual and ultimately the group, which competes against other groups. The group that is more cooperative, regardless of kinship, outcompetes the less cooperative group.
Why does this theoretical difference matter so much to the listener?
Because it fundamentally changes how you view altruism and cooperation. Kin selection views altruism as ultimately selfish. It's about preserving your genes. Group selection suggests that the group itself can become an evolutionary entity capable of genuine, non-kin-related selflessness, driven by group-level pressures. It changes the entire narrative of social evolution.
And for leading theorists like Dawkins, rejecting kin selection was like rejecting decades of foundational work.
It was heresy. And the clash became publicly vitriolic when Dawkins reviewed Wilson's 2012 book, The Social Conquest of Earth.
Dawkins' review in Prospect magazine was unsparing.
He called Wilson's argument unfocused and said that the book's theoretical errors were important, pervasive, and integral to its thesis in a way that renders it impossible to recommend. That is an unusually strong critique from one major scientist to another.
But Wilson's response in 2014 was even sharper and intensely personal.
It was. He explicitly dismissed Dawkins' standing, stating, "There is no dispute between me and Richard Dawkins, and there never has been, because he's a journalist, and journalists are people that report what the scientists have found."
Wow. That's a tremendous jab.
It implies Dawkins lacked the originality or technical depth of a true research scientist. The biologist Jerry Coyne called Wilson's remarks unfair, inaccurate, and uncharitable. Dawkins responded by detailing his own technical works, but to his credit, he maintained that their dispute was purely scientific, and he emphasized his deep admiration for Wilson's other work. It really illustrates the complex dynamics among these intellectual giants.
Okay, so moving away from the academic infighting and conceptual theory, Wilson had an undeniably positive and monumental global impact through his conservation work.
Absolutely. This part of his legacy is why he earned that widely accepted title, Father of Biodiversity.
His influence here goes beyond just the science. It really shifted public perception. He was highly effective in changing how people thought about our psychological and ethical relationship with the natural world.
Right. In 1984, he published Biophilia, introducing and exploring the concept that humanity possesses an evolutionary and psychological basis for an innate attraction and connection to the natural environment.
So it's more than just liking nature. It's a deep, essential connection, right?
Precisely. Biophilia suggests that because humans evolved in direct reliance on the natural world, we carry an inherited tendency to bond with other life forms. This isn't just sentimentality. It explains why gardens, pets, and nature documentaries are so compelling to us.
And this concept was instrumental in moving conservation ethics from a purely economic argument
Save the forest for the timber value.
to a moral and psychological necessity for human well-being.
Exactly. And he didn't just promote a theory, he defined the crisis itself. He is credited with introducing the very term we use to talk about the global ecological crisis.
He literally coined the term.
He did. In 1988, he edited a volume called Biodiversity, based on a foundational U.S. national conference on the subject. That volume introduced the term biodiversity, a contraction of biological diversity, into the global scientific and political lexicon. It effectively created the modern field of biodiversity studies overnight.
And he became a powerful, visual, and highly articulate advocate for ecological preservation, deeply concerned with the accelerating mass extinctions of the 20th century.
His advocacy often focused on the sheer incomprehensibility of the loss. When he was advocating at the U.S. Capitol in 1998, he emphasized that cutting down an ancient forest isn't just removing big trees. He said it is drastically imperiling a vast array of species within a few square miles. Many of them are still unknown to science.
And he focused attention on the microscopic and often neglected life forms like fungi and microorganisms.
Right, the things science hadn't yet discovered, but which played a key role in the maintenance of that ecosystem.
And he had a genius for these memorable analogies that immediately struck a chord with the public and with policymakers.
The most famous example, which I think is essential to remember, is when he powerfully equated destroying a rainforest for short-term economic gain to burning a Renaissance painting to cook a meal.
It's so vivid.
It instantly elevates the natural world to the status of irreplaceable cultural heritage, forcing a moral reconsideration of short-term profits.
And his commitment to cataloging life led to one of the largest collaborative global initiatives in science.
He was instrumental in launching the Encyclopedia of Life, EOL, initiative. The ambitious goal was to create a comprehensive, open, and searchable database to include information on all 1.9 million species currently recognized by science.
And EOL now includes information on practically all known species.
With contributions from hundreds of international partners, it's a monumental project and a beautiful reflection of his own taxonomic background. I mean, he personally discovered and formally described over 400 new species of ants during his career.
His final grand sweeping proposal, which really crystallized his response to the extinction crisis, was the Half-Earth Initiative.
This is perhaps his most daunting legacy. Confronting the accelerating loss of species, Wilson proposed in 2014 and formalized in his 2016 book, Half-Earth, that the only viable solution was to dedicate 50% of the Earth's surface land and sea for the exclusive use of other species to thrive.
50%? That sounds radical. What was the scientific logic behind such a massive proposal?
The scientific logic ties directly back to his theory of island biogeography and something called species area curves. The math shows that if you protect half the world's surface, you statistically protect around 85% of the world's species.
And if you protect anything less?
You guarantee a massive, irreversible loss of biodiversity. The premise is that setting aside 50% of the world's surface is necessary to maintain the ecological networks required for long-term species survival and planetary health. And this concept became the basis for the ongoing Half-Earth Project.
It's also worth pausing here to note his complex view on religion, which was another area where he sought synthesis but often found conflict.
That's a great point. While he was a staunch advocate for a scientific worldview, he was a provisional deist. He explicitly denied the label of atheist and preferred to be called agnostic.
He argued that religious faith and rituals are powerful phenomena, products of evolution themselves, and shouldn't be dismissed outright.
Right, but they should be scientifically investigated to better understand their significance to human nature and social cohesion. This led to his famous outreach effort. In his book, The Creation, Wilson specifically argued that scientists should offer the hand of friendship to religious leaders to build a necessary alliance to save the planet.
He viewed the protection of creation as the one topic where science and faith should absolutely come together.
Exactly. He stated that science and religion are two of the most potent forces on Earth, and they should come together to save the creation. Yet his views often oscillated. Later in a 2015 interview, he was more forceful, stating that for the sake of human progress, the best thing we could possibly do would be to diminish religious faiths. It shows the fundamental conflict he felt between objective science and dogma.
Okay, to provide a complete and balanced deep dive for you, the learner, we have to address the complex and frankly troubling revelations that surfaced after his death in 2021.
This is a vital part of understanding the full portrait of Wilson. It casts a shadow over aspects of his highly celebrated legacy.
Following his passing at the end of 2021, an examination of his personal correspondence, which was donated to the Library of Congress, revealed a significant tension between his public persona as a champion of inclusive natural science and his private support for highly controversial figures.
Figures whose work bordered on or actively promoted scientific racism.
The sources reveal Wilson's connection and support for the Canadian psychologist J. Philippe Rushton. And we need to be very clear here. Rushton's work focused on controversial, largely discredited theories linking race and intelligence.
He often relied on global comparisons that the broader scientific community regards as methodologically flawed, deeply biased, and racist. Rushton later went on to head the Pioneer Fund, an organization that's often associated with scientific racism.
And the correspondence shows that, beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Wilson wrote emails defending Rushton's work to his colleagues. Critically, Wilson also sponsored a highly controversial article written by Rushton in the prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
PNAS. That sponsorship alone carried tremendous institutional weight.
And what about the review process for that article?
The records indicate that during the review process for that specific Rushton article, Wilson was not seeking impartial scientific evaluation. The sources suggest he intentionally sought out specific reviewers whom he believed would already agree with the article's premise.
Rather than subjecting the controversial work to rigorous, objective scrutiny from across the scientific spectrum.
Correct.
What stands out to me in these revelations is the clear evidence that Wilson was acutely aware of the professional and reputational damage this support could inflict on him. That's why he kept it entirely behind the scenes.
That's the most revealing part of the correspondence. When Rushton later approached him to sponsor a second PNAS article, Wilson declined, and his explanation reveals his internal conflict.
What did he write?
He wrote, "You have my support in many ways, but for me to sponsor an article on racial differences in the PNAS would be counterproductive for both of us."
He then explicitly admitted the fear that influenced his decision.
He did. He wrote, "Fear of being called racist, which is virtually a death sentence in American academia if taken seriously. I admit that I myself have tended to avoid the subject of Rushton's work out of fear."
This context is absolutely vital for understanding Wilson. It shows a scientist willing to privately endorse work that was widely rejected as scientifically unsound and ethically toxic by the broader community.
While consciously and strategically avoiding public association to protect his own professional standing and his institutional capital at Harvard, it reveals a profound ethical compromise.
And this difficult revelation forced immediate action from his institutional legacy. In 2022, the E.O. Wilson Biodiversity Foundation issued a formal statement on behalf of its board of directors and staff, rejecting Wilson's support of Rushton and racism after reviewing the correspondence.
The ultimate takeaway is the stark tension between his celebrated, field-defining contributions to natural science contributions that defined and saved ecosystems globally, and the ethical compromises documented in his private life concerning these deeply problematic ideologies. It forces a critical reevaluation of the scientist as both a public and a private figure.
So, we have completed a comprehensive journey through the life of E.O. Wilson, from a boy whose focus on little things was determined by a fishing accident and his exceptional 2010 vision.
Through the groundbreaking collaborative work on pheromones and the theory of island biogeography, which became the standard text for modern ecology.
Wilson was, at his core, a synthesizer. He used his deep knowledge of the superorganism of ant society, formalized in the ants, to launch the field of sociobiology, seeking to trace the connections between the smallest insect society and the broadest human culture.
And he was a scientist who won 2 Pulitzers for general nonfiction for On Human Nature and the Ants. It just demonstrates an immense ability to communicate dense scientific ideas with profound clarity to the masses.
We saw that his search for a biological explanation for human social behavior led him into intense, painful conflict.
Both ideological, with his Harvard colleagues Lewontin and Gould over tabula rasa, and interpersonal, with Richard Dawkins over the nuances of group selection.
And his private actions regarding J. Philippe Rushton further cement the complexity and contradictions of his legacy. It reveals the intense pressure scientists face when dealing with politically charged topics, and the personal compromises that can result.
But despite these towering controversies, the foundational value of his ecological and conservation work remains undisputed. He introduced the concepts of biophilia and biodiversity into the global consciousness.
And he led the charge for ecological preservation, culminating in that ambitious and maybe necessary half-Earth proposal. His contributions redefined our relationship with the natural world.
No question.
So what does this all mean for you? The final provocative thought for you to consider is this. Wilson championed scientific humanism as the worldview best suited to improve the human condition, believing that through consilience, all knowledge is a unified, singular thing.
Yet his own life, especially that private correspondence and the fear he expressed, it demonstrates the profound, sometimes contradictory tension inherent in applying hard biological truths and evolutionary explanations to the messy world of human ethics, culture, and social responsibility.
So the question to leave you with is, what does it mean for future scientific leaders when their greatest ambition is to unify all knowledge? And what ethical responsibilities must they uphold when the scientific pursuit itself becomes politically dangerous?